The dining hall at Ashworth Manor glowed with the light of 100 candles. Silver trays moved from hand to hand, and laughter drifted along the long table where the finest families of the county had gathered for the evening. Yet at the far end of that table, seated quietly with her hands folded in her lap, Eleanor Whitmore felt as though the warmth of the room could not reach her. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and painfully aware that both facts were considered a failure by the man seated at the head of the table. Lord Whitmore had spent years reminding her of it in small ways, a sigh here, a comparison there, a joke made at her expense in front of guests who laughed politely and then looked away. Tonight, however, he had had too much wine, and his patience for subtlety had worn thin. Eleanor kept her eyes on her plate. She had learned, over the years, that silence was often the safest response. She listened to the clinking of glasses, the soft music of conversation, and told herself that if she simply waited, the evening would pass as so many others had. It did not. Halfway through the second course, Lord Whitmore set down his glass with more force than necessary. The sound cut through the murmur of the room, and for a moment, all other conversation seemed to pause in response. "Look at her," he said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, gesturing toward his daughter with his glass. 24 years old and still unmarried. I have tried. Believe me, I have tried. But what man wants a wife who is plain, who barely speaks, who brings nothing of value to a match? She is worthless, I tell you. Worthless. The words landed heavier than anything Eleanor had ever heard him say before. It was one thing to feel unwanted in private. It was another to hear it declared in front of 40 guests, in a room bright with candlelight and heavy with the scent of roasted meat and expensive wine. She felt her face grow hot. Her fingers tightened around the napkin in her lap. She did not look up. She could not. If she raised her eyes, she was certain everyone would see the tears gathering there, and she refused to give her father the satisfaction of watching her cry. The silence that followed felt endless. Forks hovered above plates. A woman near the middle of the table cleared her throat awkwardly. Even the servants standing along the walls, trained to remain invisible, seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what came next. Then a chair scraped back. The sound was deliberate, unhurried, and it drew every eye in the room, including Eleanor's. She lifted her head just enough to see who had risen, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Everett Sinclair, the Duke of Rothmere. He was not a man Eleanor knew well. He had arrived earlier that evening as a guest of the host, invited to discuss matters of trade and land that held little interest for her. She had noticed him, of course. One could hardly fail to notice a duke in a room full of lesser titles, but she had assumed, as she assumed of most powerful men, that he took no notice of her in return. She was wrong. The Duke said nothing to Lord Whitmore. He offered no argument, no scolding glance, no attempt to embarrass her father in front of his guests. Instead, he walked the length of the table, his boots striking softly against the polished floor, until he stood beside Eleanor's chair. He extended his hand. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the silent room, "I believe the musicians are preparing to play. Would you do me the honor of a dance?" For a moment, Eleanor could only stare at him. Surely she had misunderstood. Surely a duke, a man of such standing, had no reason to single her out, especially not now, not after what her father had just said. But his hand remained extended, patient and steady, and his eyes held nothing but quiet certainty. She glanced toward her father. His face had gone pale, his earlier boldness replaced by something closer to confusion. He said nothing. Eleanor placed her hand in the Duke's. As he led her from the dining hall into the adjoining ballroom, she was acutely aware of every eye following them. Whispers began to stir behind fans and raised glasses, but for the first time all evening, Eleanor found she did not care what was being said about her. The Duke's hand was warm around hers, and his steps were unhurried, as though the two of them had all the time in the world. The orchestra, sensing the moment, began a slow waltz. The Duke guided her onto the floor and settled his hand at her waist with an ease that immediately calmed her trembling nerves. For several long moments he said nothing at all, simply allowing the music to fill the space that her father's cruelty had hollowed out inside her chest. Then, As they turned slowly beneath the chandeliers, he finally spoke. "Your father's words were not truth," he said quietly, meant only for her ears. They were the ramblings of a man too small to recognize what stands directly in front of him. Eleanor's eyes stung, but she held herself steady, matching his steps with careful precision. "You don't know me, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know enough," he replied. "I have watched you all evening, Miss Whitmore, long before your father spoke. I watched the way you listened when others talked, offering your full attention even to guests who barely noticed you in return. I watched the kindness you showed the young servant who spilled wine on your sleeve. You smiled at him and told him not to worry, when most in this room would have scolded him. I watched the patience you showed your father, even as his temper grew worse with every glass of wine. Worthless is the last word I would ever choose to describe you." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, unable to trust her voice. The music swelled around them, and she found herself grateful for its cover, for the way it gave her a reason to stay quiet while she gathered herself. "Why would you do this?" she finally asked. "Stand up, ask me to dance, in front of everyone." The Duke's expression softened. "Because someone needed to. And because I found that I wanted to." They continued to dance, and slowly, Eleanor felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease. She was aware, distantly, that the entire room was watching them, that this dance would be spoken of for weeks in drawing rooms across the county. But here, within the circle of the Duke's arms, none of that seemed to matter. He asked her about herself, not about her prospects, or her father's estate, or the things most men inquired about when speaking with an unmarried woman of her age. He asked what she enjoyed reading, whether she preferred the countryside or the city, what she thought of the music playing around them. Eleanor found herself answering more honestly than she had in years, surprised by how easily the words came when someone actually seemed to want to hear them. When the waltz ended, the Duke did not release her hand right away. He held it a moment longer, studying her face as though committing it to memory. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I would like to call on you next week, properly, with your father's consent, if he is willing to give it, or without it, if he is not." Eleanor blinked, certain she had misheard him. "You wish to call on me?" "I do." "But my father—" "Your father," the Duke interrupted gently, "said a great many things tonight that were not his to say. I do not intend to let his opinion decide what I choose to do next." Eleanor felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She had spent so many years believing the things her father said about her, quietly accepting them as truth, simply because no one had ever offered a different view. Now, standing in the Duke's steady presence, she began to wonder if perhaps her father had been wrong all along. "Yes," she said softly, "you may call on me." The Duke smiled, and for the first time that evening, Eleanor found herself smiling in return. The days that followed passed differently than any Eleanor had known before. Word of the dinner had spread quickly, as such things always did, and she found herself the subject of curious glances and hushed conversations wherever she went. Some of the whispers were unkind, wondering aloud why a duke would show such interest in a woman her father himself had called worthless. Others were more generous, suggesting that perhaps the Duke of Rothmere had simply seen something in her that others had overlooked. Eleanor tried not to listen to either kind of talk. She had spent enough of her life shaped by other people's opinions of her. She was determined, for once, to focus instead on what she herself believed to be true. The Duke called on her exactly as he had promised, arriving at Ashworth Manor the following week with a bouquet of white roses and an easy, confident manner that put even the household staff at ease. Lord Whitmore, still visibly shaken by the events of the dinner, greeted him with a stiffness that bordered on fear. He said little, as the Duke asked permission to walk with Eleanor through the gardens, and he offered no objection when the request was granted. In the gardens, away from the watching eyes of the manor, Eleanor found it easier to speak freely. She told the Duke about her mother, who had died when Eleanor was young, and how much of the warmth in the house had disappeared along with her. She told him about the books she read in secret, hidden from her father's disapproving gaze, and the small dreams she had once allowed herself before learning it was safer not to want anything at all. The Duke listened to all of it without judgment. In turn, he shared pieces of his own life, the weight of his title, the loneliness that sometimes came with it, the difficulty of knowing which people valued him for himself, and which valued only his position. Eleanor found comfort in the honesty between them, a kind of comfort she had never experienced with anyone else. Their walks in the garden became a weekly occurrence, and then a more frequent one. Slowly, the whispers around the county began to shift, less concerned with why the Duke had chosen her, and more focused on how well suited the two of them seemed to be. Eleanor began to stand a little taller at gatherings, to speak a little more freely, no longer shrinking into the background out of habit. Lord Whitmore never apologized for what he had said that evening. He was not a man given to admitting fault, and Eleanor had long ago stopped expecting an apology from him, but he also never spoke against her again, not in public and certainly not within earshot of the Duke, whose quiet authority seemed to command a respect that Lord Whitmore's own bluster never had. Eleanor noticed the change in her father, even if she chose not to dwell on it. There was a carefulness in the way he spoke to her now, an awareness that his words carried consequences he had not previously considered. She did not need his approval any longer, but she found a small, quiet satisfaction in knowing that he could no longer dismiss her so easily. Months passed, and what had begun as a single dance in a candlelit ballroom grew into something neither Eleanor nor the Duke had expected. There was no dramatic proposal, no grand gesture meant to impress onlookers. Instead, one evening in the same garden, where they had shared their first honest conversation, the Duke simply took her hand and asked if she would consider spending the rest of her life beside him. Eleanor did not hesitate. Their engagement was announced not with her father's blessing, though he offered no objection either, but with Eleanor's own quiet certainty that she deserved this happiness. She had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of love, of attention, of anything beyond quiet endurance. It had taken one man's willingness to stand up, to cross a silent room and extend his hand, to show her that the truth about her worth had never depended on her father's opinion at all. On the day of the wedding, as Eleanor walked down the aisle toward the man who had first seen her true value in a room full of people who had not, she thought back to that dinner months before. She remembered the humiliation, the burning shame of her father's words, the way she had wished the floor might simply open and swallow her whole. She was grateful now that it had not, for it was in that very moment of deepest hurt that something unexpected had happened. A chair had scraped back, a hand had been offered, and a single dance had changed the entire course of her life. Eleanor Whitmore, once called worthless at her father's table, became the Duchess of Rothmere, cherished not for her title or her fortune, but for exactly who she was, and she never doubted her own worth again.